everybody. I'm Christine Kwon. I am moderating. It's my debut. Let's get a round of applause for everyone's first books. I'm also loving how this is an all-woman crew up here. It feels really good. Seems like a very good year for publishing in New Orleans, 2024. So just to get us acquainted, it was so lovely getting to spend some time with your books recently, and we have, sorry, this is the most New Orleans thing. I wrote my notes on an anti-gravity. Okay. We have Hood Wellness by Tamela Gordon. And that is a memoir. We have I'll Give You a Reason, a collection of short stories from Annell López, Around the Gate, poems by M.A. Nicholson, The Flat Woman, a novel by Vanessa Saunders, Spring on the Peninsula, a novel by Ery Shin, and Habitations by Sheila Sundar, which is also a novel. So just to start us off with, publishing is very hard. It's probably always been difficult, but these days it's very hard to get like a book out there. So I was wondering what your paths to publication were like. Yeah, and anyone can begin. There's another mic over there too. I'll pass this down to whoever's ready.
Happy to go first half. So I had a very probably unusual path to publication in the sense that it was ultimately published as a novel, but I initially wrote it as poetry. And I sent it out like way too early. I think there's a difference between wanting something to be finished and then it actually being finished. So I sent it out for the first time in 2018. It was longlisted at Tarplin Sky Press. It was a finalist for the Lyric Essay Prize with Seneca Review, even though it's not a lyric essay at all. and then I had an agent who told me to rewrite it as innovative fiction because poetry wasn't doing really well. And this was like pandemic times now, so publishing was bad, poetry was bad. And that ended up being good advice. And then it finally landed at a innovative press Fiction Collective 2, which lives at University of Alabama Press. But in that time, I got 40 rejections, which is a lot. And I think a lot of that was to do with the fact that it was too fiction-y for poetry, and then for a while it was too poetry for fiction-y. So when I moved it over and made it more accessible and a little bit less weird, although it's still really weird, then it was more exciting to a broader audience, and I think more accessible. So I did have an agent tell me, to stop working on it, to give up. He's like, in this market right now, it's not going to work out. And, I did put it to the side, but I always came back to it, and I never gave up on it. And I think that was probably what ultimately led to its success, was just being extremely stubborn and not giving up on myself. So.
I like that answer. I would say that my path to publishing has been pretty progressive, but also reflective of the work that I do and that I write about. Hood Wellness is a collection of stories and testimonies from people around the country that have hyper-marginalized identities. And one of the major themes is mutual aid. So I was actually signed by Row House Publishing, and they are reliant on mutual aid to get a lot of our books published. So I basically was able to just do this on a bigger scale. And because we are incredibly rooted in justice of all kinds, racial, gender, anti-genocides, all of it, we were very adamant in making sure that accessibility was at the forefront of getting this book. So we're distributed by Simon & Schuster, and they really wanted it to be a hardcover. They appreciated the social science aspects and really believed that this was like a award-winning kind of book. And hardcover is $30. Softcover is $16.99. And it was one of those major decisions that we had made along the way, and staying true to the accessibility opposed to the accolades. And ultimately, was about 6 months before Hood Wellness came out, that it earned a Kirkus Star. And that basically just kind of gave it that, critical acclaim that the white folks were really thirsty for. So after that, I feel like they just kind of got off my back, and I've just been outside promoting my book.
It's really hard to follow. So I, not hard to follow, hard to follow me, it's hard to follow what you said because that was so good. But my path towards publication started, I think, about 10 years before I began writing what became my debut, which I'm glad I didn't know at the time. I think I may have felt like maybe I think I may have lost some confidence in the process, but I spent a long time working on a novel in a very, very dense work of historical fiction, and trying in the process of writing the novel to really learn how you wrote a novel. How do you incorporate research into a story? How do you build a character arc? How do you create stakes and drama? How do you develop characters? And all the things that I had been sort of ingesting as a reader, obviously, but laying it on the page and creating your own fictional world is very, very different. And so this was, for years and years and years, I wrote very much in the margins of evenings and weekends and whenever I could, and it was just like, as the way many of us begin and many of us continue our writing lives, but I was absolutely devoted to figuring out this one book. And when I finally realized that this was not going to be the book for me, that I needed to actually start over, that I had spent so long immersed in this process that I actually needed to step away from it. And other ideas were becoming interesting to me. Other characters were kind of entering into my imagination. And so I set aside, I did my MFA in a very inconvenient time in my life. I had 3 young kids, and I knew that I needed to kind of go away and learn how to write for a year. And so I did that, and in the process, I think making a very kind of unconventional and very difficult life choice, I realized that I was deeply invested in this. That if I was going to leave my family behind and go to a different city, coming home every other weekend, that I wasn't going to do this because it was a passing interest. This was going to be my life. And so the way in which I devoted myself to what became my first novel was different in that I did not allow myself the possibility of not writing it. So every time I got to a point, one, I had learned so much from the failure of the first novel, so much. And so, and I'm sure, as we talk more about the writing process, I'll happily address this again, but I think the most defining piece of my path to publication was that there was a failed novel that came before my debut. And I think for many of us, debut that's the first book that's published, but it's not the first book we write. And I could not possibly have written Habitations without that novel that I thought for so long was a failure, and actually was fundamental and of real importance to me creatively. Habitations came after. Sure. Is the audio okay? Are we audible? I'll just start. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah? I can't see anyone. Sheila, I had to wait until my children were much older, and then I sold my home and went back to school so that I could become a writer. And then bring those skills back to my classroom. I'm in my 23rd year of education in teaching literature, and now teaching creative writers. So it's all a very integrated process for me, a very integrated lifestyle for me. The book is my thesis. And I wrote the first poem when I went to my first workshop with John Ery in Greenberg in 2017. We had a weekend in Venice, and a friend of mine from workshop, we took 3 buses to Lido, and I directed the first poem that I published, and it's the first poem that's in the book, or at least the first poem that I wrote that's in the book. And was in the MA and the MFA, taking creative writing classes in the MA, focusing very intensely on poetry and creative nonfiction in the MFA. And when it came time to work on the thesis, I love making books. Like, I really love making books. And I sat down with 5 years worth of work
and essentially pulled the thread. I was able to sort of pull one person, like one sort of unified persona out of the collection, and sort of track this coming of age process. And for winter break in 2021, I did not leave my house for weeks, working on this manuscript. And then it was laid out on my table, all 4 sections of 11 poems each. And part of the revision process really was fine-tuning those revisions to weave together every poem in the collection is essentially in some way connected to every other poem. Finished the MFA in that spring, submitted it to maybe 3 different places, including for the Hilary Tam Capital Collection, which I was nominated to submit to because of my volunteer work in the community through Body Magazine at the time. It was not accepted. And so I put it to bed. It had been a really intense 5 years. And when I tell you that I did not leave the house, when I went to start my vehicle at the end of winter break after working on this manuscript, my car would not start. The battery had completely died. Like I literally just, everything was about that book. And I started my teaching position, and I kind of forgot about it for a while. And I went on this gorgeous writing retreat with the Tennessee Williams Festival that it happens 2, maybe 3 times a year. It's curated by Richard Booth. And really launched back into writing again at that point. And so my friend Nikki called me. She said, Michelle, have you submitted to the Hilary Tam? I said, no, I missed the deadline. She said, no, you did not submit the book. And so I pulled it out. And had a couple of friends read it. One of whom gave me some really good feedback, said, I'm just not sure about this poem. It just doesn't really fit with the rest. And in addressing that poem, the reason why it essentially didn't fit with the rest, in order to solve that writing problem, I had to pull maybe 6 other poems from the collection. And I replaced those with the poems that I wrote at the marathon night. And the opening poem in the collection is from that writing marathon. And so rearranged maybe 2 poems and sent it out to the Hilary Tam. And said, we're going to do this. I sent it out to maybe 4 other places for publication after that. And then I got the call, that was in May, and I got the call in August saying that the manuscript had been accepted. And I just felt so blessed. And was able to put my daughter's artwork on the cover, and had just a really great experience. Ery Shin helped me edit the final collection. And there was one poem in particular that I knew it needed to be there. It was an absolute necessary bridge, but it wasn't quite there. And Brad asked me one question about that poem that really made me see it in a different way. And that was, it just really clicked everything, the whole manuscript into place, having that one poem really solidified. And so I know that maybe that's a really unusual story, but I waited really long. I wanted to be a writer as a child. I was writing as a child, but I had my daughter when I was very young, and so I turned my attention to my children for 20 years before I returned.
Can everybody hear me okay? I really love the sort of all of the things that we have in common, which is none of these books just happened. Yeah, so for I'll Give You a Reason, which is a collection of stories, I guess I can give you a description and you will already guess it's not something that screams, bestseller, or something that you automatically think that it's like a book that would be of wide interest. So it's a collection of short stories centering immigrant and first-generation Americans in America's most hated city, Newark, New Jersey. Not justifiably, because Newark is great. So I started to write these stories a while ago. I am an immigrant myself, and so for a long time I felt that I had either an imposter syndrome, or that I couldn't write, or that writing didn't belong to me, or that writing wasn't for me, or that people like myself who grew up in Newark were supposed to sort of choose these practical careers. We're supposed to sort of honor the sacrifices that our parents made to bring us into this country, and being a writer, so lucrative, doesn't seem like something that you would choose. So that was a barrier for me for a long, long time. At some point I got over it, and I realized that I'm gonna be struggling in America anyway, might as well make some art. Might as well. So I started writing stories. I pitched, they were getting published in journals, which was good news. I pitched the collection to a few agents, and their feedback was, do you have novels? Which is what you'll hear a lot based on story collections. And I was like, I don't have a novel just yet. I have a collection of stories. I started writing a novel, but I felt that there was an urgency to my path as a writer and what I had discovered that I wanted to do, which is I didn't want to sit on this anymore. And there was also an urgency to the stories that I was writing in terms of the people that were sort of being centered, the stories that were being centered, the place that I chose to write about, America's favorite city. I felt that it needed to come out sooner than later. So I didn't have time to wait on a novel that I was going to write myself, which I knew was going to take me a long time. It's a novel. And so I saw that there was another avenue to getting this published, which was a fiction prize by Defendants Press. The Louis Meriwether the First Book Prize. So I submitted. I was still in my MFA here in New Orleans, studying with Michelle at some point, which was wonderful. At some point during my second year in the MFA, the book became a finalist. So I had to hold that secret for a long time until I knew that I had won the prize, and so the book came out in the spring. Thank you. But I think that, a lot of it took a long time to write, but I think that there are so many other barriers that are self-imposed or just life barriers that just add on to the years. It's hard to put out a book, but it's also hard to put out certain books that are, centering specific messages that this is going to be, there's going to be some sort of gatekeeping that's going to keep this book from really making its way. And that being, I would say, in some ways, the biggest impediment. But the book is out, and people like it. And I'm glad to be here.
So I wrote the novel in one fell swoop over 2-3 months. The first draft came very quickly, actually, and I finished it in the winter of 2019, and it was finally picked up in 2023 and came out in 2024, so it took a long time. My agent at the time, my agent still, he had basically given up on it. He said, I saw some potential here, but it's not landing. People don't think it's going to be commercially successful enough. It's too niche. It's not what they're looking for. And then they were very, very tough editors, so I had to redo the entire thing anyway. So it took a long time, but the funny thing is he was incredibly heat-spared because I wrote an academic book before, and those take a long time. They take 4 to 7 years anyway, that cycle. So for me, I didn't feel that we were out of time. I can wait. I can keep going. But one major change that I made from the beginning to finally when somebody picked it up, I had to give the main character, K, a gender. First, he started off without a gender, it was just K, and that came up over and over again, but I think that was incredibly grating for everyone who read it, so then we fixed that. We made it much less sexual, much less violent, much less explicit, and then that, I think, made it a little bit more palatable, even though I still don't yeah, I mean, let's see. But anything in the future, I'm gonna make it much more, I think, neater, more Hollywood.
I have so many follow-up questions, just listening to everyone. And I guess kind of combining from listening. So Annell, you talked about like imposter syndrome. And Sheila, you talked about like taking time away from your family in order to write. And M.A., Michelle, you talked about how you raised your kids for 20 years first and then wrote this book. And I was wondering if anyone would want to speak to like how do you retain your identity as a writer even without that first book out? And how do you kind of hold on to that identity and like have it be a part of yourself when there's not much concrete evidence out there in the real world yet?
That's a great
Just
question.
anybody.
I think that the funny thing about that is there's always this kind of magical rope that we have about writers on when you can call yourself a writer and when you can call yourself an author. And as somebody who, you know, I had the idea for Hood Wellness, I was waitressing at Olive Garden. I'm a high school dropout. And so when I put a pen to the pad, when I open up my Microsoft Word, I'm a writer. And I think that for a lot of us, it really does come with that self-awareness of knowing I have the capability of telling this story. I can tell this story to completion. That's essentially, you know, the heart of being a writer. But I personally, I felt bad because I'm child-free, I don't even have a fish. So I was able to just kind of gallivant in New Orleans and write and just be like that was my identity. So much so that I kind of missed that because then you got to go out in the world and promote the book. But I do think that it's time that we start revisiting personally and collectively what we're identifying as a writer, as an author, because more often than not, these goalposts were not set by us. They were set by old white men. They were set by wealthy white women. The level of privilege, and it's not just excluded to race, because even in New York, you know, things can be very gate-kept as being a black writer. I didn't go to Hillman, I don't have connections, I'm not gonna be on Tamron Hall next week, and so I have to know that I'm a writer, because it's not going to get validated when I walk into a lot of rooms.
Thank you, Tamela. Because, yeah, 100%. I think that there's, like you said, a level of self-awareness that you sort of have to arrive at. I think that for me, it was I think that I had to arrive at that understanding. I think that it's hard, you know, it's hard. I think that it's, for me, you know, I was a teacher, I'm still a teacher. I was a high school teacher at a charter school for a long time in Newark, and that became my identity, right? So that work environment sort of became of who I was. And there were all these other reasons why I wasn't comfortable calling myself a writer. And it took all of my 20s, it took turning 30, it took leaving that job. It took cashing out my retirement fund in New Jersey, moving to New Orleans, and taking all these risks of saying, you know what, like, the crazy thing is also understanding sort of how I function in my identity in the world, where I may call myself a writer, I may call myself a good writer. Someone may not think that, and I think that's okay. I think that that is also part of, you know, understanding that people will see you and define you in one way, and it becomes then a personal choice of understanding that, yeah, unless you arrive at that answer and that self-awareness, it's going to be really hard to move on from that. So, yeah, and you sharing, you know, having worked at Olive Garden or not having had those connections, like, you know, those are things that could have kept you, but they didn't, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I was just really compelled to when you spoke about the moment you open the notebook or the document, and that feeling that Annell, you touched on just now, that assertion of the value of the writing that you're doing. And I had this feeling as I was working on habitations that if somebody came up to me and said, you know, I do watercolors and I have a studio, but you can't ever come into it and see my work, I would think like, I don't think you're painting. Like, I'm like, what is that really weird? But that was so much what I was saying to the world, like, I'm working on something. One day you'll see it, but I can't show you yet. And what shifted was, I also came from a teaching background, was teaching in New York City and then taught in the charter system in New Orleans, and that is work that takes everything from you that you're willing to give it, and you wanted to because you're working with children, of course you wanted to. And you're working with a system that is also broken, and so it is, the love and labor that you want to pour into that is limitless. And so I often felt in that time that this is where I think in retrospect I came to this realization. So it's less I think about what I told myself at the time, because I had to give myself countless pep talks, but afterwards, after finishing Habitations, I realized that those years where I felt that the labor was what pulled me away from my writing, and I had nothing left. I had nothing left at the end of the day after teaching sometimes. I could not open that notebook. Sometimes I could, but sometimes I just couldn't. The stack of papers felt so enormous. And then I did feel when I was writing that the humanity and love and devotion that went into those teaching years, there's no way I could have written Habitations had I not experienced that work. There's no way. The book was infused with the humanity of having been a teacher. It is infused with the humanity of having been alive in the world and doing all the things that I taught were the things that were stopping me from writing. So I think in the end, it's actually, the time that we spend writing is actually much bigger than the time we spend working on the book.
Yeah, I think the question of like, how can you make the time in which you're kind of limiting yourself or not really being comfortable with yourself on the page, how can you make that shorter? And I think, because I teach creative writing, I think about my own struggles with imposter syndrome, my own feeling like I was writing poetry because I think I was like afraid to unleash and maybe like afraid to like embrace my own identity on the page. Specifically in the realm of humor, I did not feel like comfortable being like funny or kind of having the same kind of semi-quirky, funny personality that I have in real life. I felt super afraid to do that and afraid of what judgments people might make of me. And so I think that, yeah, trauma does have a real place in the writing process, and especially when it's your first book, when you haven't gotten that bigger sense of validation yet, and you don't get the sense of like, yeah, I'm a writer. You're like, I'm someone who writes, but I'm not a writer until I have a book. And no one seems to really care about you until you have a book, unless you win a big contest or something. And so I feel like a lot of it is like, for me, I had to realize like going back to your inner child. Like they say that you're like a creative genius when you're 5, that everyone is. But you lose that as you grow up through education, through identity, and maybe feeling like you're not the identity that is a writer, or the stuff that you're writing about isn't like accepted by the literary world. And so, yeah, I think it's a process of like getting people to like say yes to you, and also learning how to say yes to yourself. Because I was saying no to myself for years. I was like, no, that's weird, or that's perverted, or that's a really stupid joke to make. And so I had to figure out how to just be like, no matter how crazy this is, just try it, and you can take it out later if it works. But yeah, it's an interesting question. It's one that I think about honestly all the time, and I'm still trying to get better at it myself.
This is a tricky question because it deals with the writer's ego. In our heart of hearts, or in my heart of hearts, I wish I could be somebody who could say, if I call myself a writer, then that's it doesn't matter. But then at the same time, I've pushed so hard for this to be released in the public, in a publicly recognized format, and for public recognition. So then how sincere am I if I say it that way? So I'm constantly caught in the catch-22 of write for myself. I wrote something that I can stand behind. I wrote something that's true to my style, my color. But then at the same time, I do also write for others. So when I say I'm going to write more Hollywood, half-jokingly for the future, I am also thinking about the market. I am also thinking about critics. I am also thinking about these kinds of public conversations. I want people to get it, to feel it the way that I feel it. So it's a very tricky thing, being solitary, but also social, being a stray cat, but also one of a herd. So I bounce back. I don't think there's a clear, straightforward answer to that for me personally.
As a creative writing teacher, I'm herding cats all day. But I think that also, because I work with young writers, part of my constant conversation with them is speaking to them as writers, and I do firmly believe that. That's like totally authentic. So even if you haven't published, that doesn't mean that you're not a writer. And I think that it's really an epistemological mode. It's a way of thinking about and perceiving and processing the world. And you can't not have that kind of processor. That's the kind of processor you have. If you are, and of course I grew up in New Orleans in this rich storytelling culture. My mother had, when I was very young, gave me those hardback books, the paper books, and they were all images. And so my mother was teaching me to tell stories, these sort of ekphrastic stories, at 18 months old. And so, like, storytelling was always a part of my life. Dance, and then there's an extension to that, of that poetry and theater. All of these things growing up in this community, performance, have been a part of my life. And the writing is just an extension of that kind of constantly processing, making these sort of creative connections, applying it to the stories that you've already heard. And so I've always thought of myself as a storyteller and a poet, in community with other storytellers and poets and performers. And so the book is just an eventual manifestation of that, if given time. I think that all of us have given time to our craft to manifest that, especially if we have support from our community. And so, again, the teaching has always been a really important part of nourishing my life as a reader, and my community has really also supported that in really very important ways.
Just a little quick follow-up question. So many of you have mentioned teaching, and I also teach currently, and I've taught for the past 10 years. I really view it kind of, especially in New Orleans, as, because it's paid so poorly, as an act of service. And I was wondering how teaching has kind of affected your writing, if at all.
I mean, I don't write about teaching, not yet. That's like a massive, well, and the thing is, I also, like, I guess I wouldn't write about teaching as a poet. I do a lot of other kinds of writing. I do critical writing, I do academic writing, and so there are different outlets for that as well. I don't know if that's really an answer though. Maybe somebody, Annell, you teach.
I can talk about this a long time, so stop me. I think teaching is just boot camp for hard times. Like, I honestly think that if you can, I'll put it to you this way. Publishing is, hard because you'll be rejected a lot. You'll hear a lot of things you don't want to hear. But if you have spent any time in a regular New Orleans classroom, Newark classroom, a New York City classroom, man, you really are, you go through it. And if you can survive that, just bring it on. Anything is just light work. So, when I taught in Newark, we used to give our high schoolers evaluation forms, and they were anonymous, and there were, multiple choice questions, as well as open-ended space. And those very loving Newark children, they were Newark children. They would go in and tell you so much about yourself. And if you can survive a round of evaluations there's nothing an editor can say to you. There's not a rejection that can touch you. You are unstoppable. Yeah. That's how I see teaching.
Okay, quickly switching gears, because we only have about 30 minutes left. Because I can also talk about teaching all day, but it's not the place for it right now. So Sheila, your book is about kind of like a journey that's taken after the death of a sister, and Ery, your book is also kind of about a journey taken after a failed relationship. And I was wondering how you think, or if you can speak about loss and, you know, the kind of journey the self takes from you know, stemming from loss.
Oh gosh, that's such a wonderful question. One of the important functions of loss in my novel was that my character endures something that is so far from anything that I've ever experienced. I mean, there is no person who hasn't experienced loss. There's always something we can touch and access in a story of loss. But the particular loss she endured was something that I just had to work so hard to imagine. And so the book, the rigors of imagination were something that, again, I could scarcely have imagined until that became part of my character story. And in early drafts, that was not who she was. In early, you play around with your characters, you're getting to know them. And when it came to me that there was this component of her past, this secret that she was holding, and I started to write that into drafts further along, I found that the grief of losing a younger sister in the way that she did was something, and Brad and I have been in a writing group for some time, and those people who are in my writing group know that if there's harm that comes to a child in a story, that they have to tell me in advance, and I will just not show up. And so I have a very, very hard time with the type of loss that I put into my book in other narratives. And so it became, she became somebody that I had to work so hard to imagine every time she walked into a room, because I understood that the level of her grief was something that she never She never walked into a room and didn't feel a wall between her and the people around her who had not endured that. And so I felt that in some ways, there were so many ways that it shaped the experience of writing the novel. And the way that writing the novel made me very sad very often, because you become people that you love very much, and you don't want them to suffer. I mean, you don't want any person in the world to suffer, fictional or otherwise. I mean, I would like to live in a world where that is the case. And so pushing the novel from the kind of world that I want, and putting the character in a situation that I just wish that she had not been in, made me love her more, made me worry for her more, made me champion her in many ways, made me understand her misgivings, her inhibitions, her fears. And every time she walked into a room, I would ask myself how she is navigating the weight of that loss, even though as the novel progresses, it was 5, 10, 15 years in the past, but still it was fresh to her. And she's a child in the novel, and thinking about the way in which she navigated pregnancy, childbirth, the raising of a young kid, again with that weight, and there was never a page in which I wasn't thinking about it.
My novel starts off where Kay, the main character, has been abandoned by his longtime lover, and the heartbreak from that, and I think grief, especially romantic grief, it makes a lot of us nervous as a society, because it's not uncommon that people just can't get over it. It really just destroys or ruins a person, hence why there's so much emphasis on community, people coming together, therapy, family, friends that you can turn to, because sometimes you just can't find a healthy way of breathing and getting over it. And then what a shame and what a terror that is. And how did somebody describe it to me? This person is alive somewhere, but they're dead for you, even though they're alive for everyone else. And I think how it shatters your self-esteem, because you are personally rejected. Everything about you they said no to. And so how do you recover from that, or not? And in this particular story, Kay, the main character, is unable to get over it and unable to follow this idealized narrative that society pushes upon people for good cause. You need to move on, you need to live for yourself, you need to keep on enjoying life. But for Kay, he can't. He's heartbroken. love's cruelty has left him a shadow of his former self, and so he begins in a strange journey through Seoul's nightlife and its office culture, and I don't know where he ends up at the end.
It's too late to read it now, bro.
No, I was looking for something. So, Tamela, you talked about hyper-marginalized identities, right? And I think, Ery, you were mentioning like how to make your book more palatable. And I wanted to ask, what was the thinking around like being a writer of color and knowing that, you know, you're going against this tradition that, Tamela, you were saying, like, you know, is white male. And you know, you're still kind of entering that tradition. We're in the Western world, and ultimately, like, if you want to kind of enter the canon, you're still kind of partaking. And I was just wondering how you thought, if at all, about like, okay, so this book, it is gonna kind of go into the white world of literature. And do I want to make it more palatable, more appetizing to everybody? And I think, Tamela, you were saying like, okay, the white folks are really gonna like this, and your book is called Hood Wellness. Like, was there any part of you that felt like you were kind of like packaging the book in a way that, you know, it would sell better or anything like that?
So I think the first thing to notice is the cover of my book, which is an unambiguously Black woman wearing a bonnet with nameplate earrings. And that within itself, I think it's very clear on who the target reader is as well as who the author is. In regard of the feeling of entering into, of course, this book industry is predominantly white, predominantly male. That doesn't break my connection with my target audience. And I say often, you can plan a picnic, but you can't predict the weather. So just as Toni Morrison said, I want everybody to read my book, and also I write for Black people. The stories and the people and the voices, to be hyper-marginalized isn't necessarily reduced by race. There's a story of Holly, who was a Vietnamese woman dying of cancer. And for her, her testimony was about what wellness looks like when you're in a dying body. There's stories about ACT UP and what that means to be a young gay male fighting a disease while you are also fighting for your rights and the rights of your community. So ultimately, as far as I'm concerned, that's so many people, I don't really have to worry about white people at all. It's great that they enjoy the book. I'm a writer, and so it's meant to be enjoyed. I regret that we are living in this day and age where we are writing books for white women, we are writing books for white men. It is on the cover, it is very clear about who this is for and who that's not. I find it to be very reductive. I find it to be a killer of all art. So I don't really entertain that to any capacity. I think there's something to be said for the fact that everyone can enjoy my book. I write in my own language. I use Ebonics frequently, as do other authors in the book. Nobody really needs like a thesaurus to figure out what we're trying to say. I think that ultimately it comes to honoring my art. It comes to honoring the message, as well as the dialogue that I'm having with the reader. But you know, it's out in the wild now, and so I can't control who's reading it or what their assessment is. But I don't put myself in that category, because then the next thing you know, it's kind of like, am I the Black writer on the panel? Am I the Black writer on the bookshelf? I only am if I condone that and if I'm showing up in that way. So even as I'm answering this question, I'm kind of answering it as an author opposed to like as the Black woman author.
So in my mind, I was writing for an international English-speaking audience of multiple ethnicities. So I had to do a tricky balancing act I didn't use any Korean words anglicized, or I didn't do that. I did in a way that everyone could follow. But all of the literary allusions and references are actually very multicultural, predominantly Korean, actually, Korean, Chinese, Japanese. So I didn't use any of the, Murakami loves classical music, he loves Western rap. I didn't do that, I didn't do that pattern. So I consciously really broke with the Western canon in my way. And then in terms of changing things, actually because I'm being published in America within the American market, even though of course I hope it reaches a global audience, yeah, violence against children and children having kind of an inner kind of sexual life or sexual thoughts. So thinking about children in a way that's not the usual, and America especially is very, very nervous about that. That was very, very tricky. Even though I don't think it was that, again, in my mind, I didn't think I was going that far beyond. But I guess for my first initial readers in the publishing industry, they were taken aback, and so I had to reel it back there. But hopefully, and again, if I am able to publish in the future, I can win enough credit to push it further next time without repelling too much. So tricky.
And Tamela, I totally loved how you had a passionate response to my question, because I feel the same way. As a Korean writer, I often, I notice that sometimes when Asian writers win poetry book prizes and stuff, they're writing about very Asian things. And I don't like how reductive that is, and my poems are not really like that, so I liked your response. Okay, so I wanted to ask this to Vanessa. Your book is a novel about all of the climate problems being blamed on women, and Ery, you also mentioned gender, and I'm sure it plays in all of our work. I was just wondering, they have that term double voice discourse, W. Du Bois and Bakhtin both write about how you're writing in this predominantly white male tradition, and as a woman, you're automatically kind of resisting that. Okay, you're writing in the white man's language or the man's language, but you're a woman, so there's this act of resistance even just in the act of writing. And you can speak to that or not, but my question was just how contemporary gender politics have affected everyone's work.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that one thing that has surprised me about the publishing industry is you think that I think before I was working in it, I thought it was going to be this revolutionary space where it was going to be more reflective about the problems of society and of division and stuff in society, because it was an art form that was often commenting on that. I think that surprisingly, in the kind of years I've been, the different agents in particular that I've worked with that haven't worked out, I have not found the publishing industry to be that kind of revolutionary space. And I have found that it kind of, in many ways, just upholds the kind of problems that the world has already, where we've talked about the kind of representation, issues of representation, in terms of the gatekeepers. We've talked about issues about, I think there's issues of representation in literature itself, and then there's also questions about audiences that you're writing for. So for me specifically, I was writing definitely for a female audience. I am okay with men reading it, but it's yeah, I give them permission. No, I'm kidding. No, it's it's a pink book. It's super pink. I was okay, yeah, that's my audience. And initially, when I was in MFA workshops, I was at times workshopping this very poetic thing as fiction. And I got some really negative letters about, and they would always come from men, and they would always be oh, you don't have enough of a conflict. I think that a lot of them would really gatekeep around the issues of conflict and their definition of the story. So yeah, I felt the way that the workshop space, like again, publishing just upholds the same kind of problems that society has in general. The way that workshop members would respond to people was super gendered. I thought that as a woman, I got maybe torn apart a lot more. But then for the guys, I felt like they weren't being given some of the criticisms that they needed for their work to improve. So at the end of the day, I'd rather be like torn apart and maybe have to throw away some of the bad feedback because it's like overly harsh or someone who just doesn't get it, as long as I can then improve the work, right? So I guess it was like, feeling slightly disillusioned, definitely my early career, like networking with different agents and meeting people, feeling like it wasn't the kind of, the utopia that I had imagined. But then using that as a really powerful agent of wanting to write against that and using that as inspiration to be even more like campy, girly, or whatever in my work. And I think that there is kind of a like very mild representation of like grotesque masculinity, especially in the beginning of the book, and that might be maybe where I like poured out my frustrations. But I'm sure that you guys maybe have similar or different, slightly different experiences. That would be really interesting to hear about too.
I don't really have like a lot of classroom experience, but I do focus a lot of my writing on the reader, and the societal barriers that I deal with on a daily basis, I refuse to let that exist in my art. So I cannot sit down and write to a trans person or a fat person or an older person and also give a wink to those outside of our community so that everyone feels involved, because then the next thing you know, the trans person, the fat person, the black person doesn't feel involved. And I think that goes back to how we have become so conditioned into writing in this very sanitized framework so that everyone feels like they're understanding things at the same time. And we're over-explaining things and we're over-breaking things down, that we know that the people that we're writing to know what we're talking about, but we want to make sure that the ones that don't. But when I sit down and I read books that weren't meant with me in mind, I'm able to figure it out. So I think that sometimes there's this way when we are factoring in the white gaze, the male gaze, that we're literally kind of infantiling our own readers because we're assuming that you're not going to know and you're not going to figure it out. I'm more concerned with making sure that it's as entertaining as it is accessible. And I think, just like using a good example, I moved here from 2021 to 2023 so that I could write the wellness. And during that time, I was dating. And the laws in Louisiana, the anti-abortion laws had just happened. And that had a major impact on my freak life. And I wanted to be able to deliver to readers to understand the impact based on your identity on what that looks like when you're trying to have an active love life. And I also wanted to make sure that the reader was equally as entertained as other lighthearted stories. And so I was able to touch on things like maternal mortality and abortion, as well as my personal dating life. And I called the essay Bustin' Nuts in an Anti-Abortion State. And I knew that by doing that my core audience was gonna know there's gonna be a little nugget in here that's gonna be funny and it's gonna be fun. But I also knew that Kirkus people would read it and value that social science that comes with educating people as a collective without feeling as though there's one target in here that I'm speaking to most, and to make sure that everybody else knows I'm gonna break everything down. So I think that ultimately, just kind of summing up, when it comes to the gazes outside of our intersection and our groups and things, that has nothing to do with what the fuck I'm writing about. They have nothing to do with who I'm writing for. And as long as I honor that, my tone stays consistent, my integrity is on level, and everyone else seems to enjoy it.
I feel when I'm sitting and writing, and there's so much in that, there's this one tiny word, but it actually means when we're sitting and writing is we're examining the range of emotions that exist in the world. We're examining all the possibilities for our characters. We're laying out all of the different options within the next minute or the next hour or the next decade of their lives. There's so much that goes into that there is no space, if we want to write well, to worry about the way in which people who will not resonate with the book might justify that lack of connection. And there are countless reasons to not love a book. There are countless books that everybody in this room does not love. And every single one of those relationships is completely okay. There are wonderful people out there who have hated or will hate my book if they read it. They're fine, I'm fine. It's all fine. But I find, even though I know that intellectually, the moment I worry about it, my writing becomes terrible. And the moment I stop worrying about it, I find myself back on the path. And it is just it never fails. It never fails to derail me, and just shutting it out never fails to get me back on the page. So, you're good.
I would add to that, Sheila, because thank you for bringing that up, and thank you, Tamela. I think that, yes, when you think about the content of the books that are, sort of, being presented and talked about today, they wouldn't exist if we put a lot of weight into, sort of specific audiences that might not be able to connect with the books. So I think that the fact that they exist already rejects a lot of those expectations, and they just are defiant just by virtue of being out.
I'd like to, Michelle?
Well, I think that I have an answer to the earlier question that's related to this, because for me, in terms of censorship, being a teacher of high school students in a conservative state is dangerous. And I have to be very careful about my public presentation of ideas and lifestyle. And so, when I was writing the book, when I was putting the book together, I was really just primarily focused on what book wanted to exist, and just on the book. And as a poet, really making sure that everything was very accessible to anyone on the page, but that there would also be layers of complexity and little eggs sort of in place for anyone to go back to it, but only if they wanted to. Only if they wanted to, and only if they were ready to notice it. But really, my concern is always thinking about what will my children think when they read this. And I think that maybe goes back to being a mother for most of my life as well. And so being a woman, being a mother, being a teacher does put some restrictions that I think that I went into writing also to kind of wrangle and to try to get over that silencing of self very slowly through a very deliberate process of risk-taking.
We have about 10 minutes left, so I'd like to just close out with 3 questions. The first 2 are going to be kind of individualized, and the last question will be about the writing process for everyone. So the first question is for Ery and Vanessa and Annell, and it's just about titles. Ery, your book is titled A Spring on the Peninsula, and for me it harkens back to like a tradition in Asian fiction where, Kawabata has like many titles, like Snow on the Mountain, and Mishima has, torrents in spring, and there's like seasons and nature in the title, and I was wondering if you were kind of referencing that. The word peninsula is obviously related to Korea, and Vanessa, I was interested in the flat woman just because it's such an interesting phrase, and I was wondering if it came from literature or how it rose. And I'll Give You a Reason is a very like direct title, and I was just wondering, how you guys landed on titling your works.
I'll go first since I'm first in line. The flat one was the first thing I came up with before anything else. I think that I knew I wanted to write a woman who was a kind of a narrative void as a kind of a critique or kind of a way to push back against like depictions of women that were extremely one-dimensional. I've talked a lot about this in my book tour, but just watching movies of the 007 movies, or James Bond when I was growing up, Pierce Brosnan devotes a whole movie to this romantic lead, and then in the next movie she's gone, it's never explained or survived. I just couldn't get over it, the fact that it wasn't even explained, that she was just completely gone. I was like, wait, where did she go? It was very upsetting at the time. So, and then another kind of interesting thing is that, of course, you think of like, oh, I came up with this idea on my own. I reread Ariel by Sylvia Plath, which was like my thing when I was in high school. I still like know a lot of those poems by heart. And there's so much references to flatness, and like this flat woman as a product of trauma. So I was like, oh, well, maybe this wasn't all me, right? Maybe it came from somewhere else too.
I'll give you a reason is, to me, a sentence starter, and there's what I imagine a blank space following the title. It's the title of one of the stories, which deals with this young Dominican girl in Newark who cannot cry, and sort of thinks of her mom always like, I'll give you something to cry about. So it was a nod at, how for people who occupy identities such as immigrant or Black or you name it, how we have to sort of code switch or hide or not live a range of emotions, how we are sort of expected to save face or just not be vulnerable. So it was a nod to that, and also because it sounds like a threat, and it just feels kind of Newark-y,
Yeah.
I was inspired. I was inspired, among other things, by a 1941 Korean colonial film by Lee Byung-il called Spring on the Korean Peninsula. I wrote an article about that. I loved the title, and I thought, let's just slim it down. It was awkwardly translated to Spring on the Peninsula, and spring, of course, has so many universal resonances, political, emotional, spiritual, and so on. So I loved that. And especially because, of course, the theme is not spring, the theme is very winter and fall.
And Michelle, as the sole poet up here, I was wondering, God, you wrote poems for 20 years, and just like, I can't imagine the process of picking and choosing for a book, just like what your process was like for choosing the order, choosing the first poem, and how you ended up thinking about that.
Well, I've lost everything that I've written 3 times, including in Katrina. So really the poems are all poems. Everything's practice, and I'm just constantly sort of writing lines in my head all the time. And it's the cadence just sort of happens automatically. In terms of the book, it really was a lot of, I literally had the book laid out. And I'm sort of obsessed with numbers and structure. And so having this sort of numerical container of the 4 sections of 11 poems, a total of 44 poems. The book is 88 pages long. Like the number component was also sort of like almost like the way that fixed form can help you to generate a poem when you have so much, right? It's a mold to pour it into. And so each sequence is sort of a parallel cycle, and it really is written sort of like where it begins is where it ends, and then that progresses and evolves as you move through each section of the book, with the final epilogue being pretty much a blueprint for the second collection that I'm working on right now in many ways. And so there's essentially a sort of like an arc in each, but also it's circular, and that is repeated throughout the text. And so, I almost went to engineering. Like I'm not And so it's a way to apply that way of thinking to wrangle and be selective about the body of work that I'm working with. And then also in terms of, when I say narrative block, it's almost, because I have this background in music and dance and vocal performance, and so there's a music to it as well. And so, the way that a symphony might sort of swell and then resolve is something that's happening over the whole arc of the book.
Oh, that was very beautiful. And just to close out, I'm going to give you two options for a question, and please just speak on one because we're good for time, meaning like it's almost over. We have a lot of transplants up here, so I believe, Ery, you're from Ames, Iowa, and you've also lived in Korea, and Annell, your book takes place in Newark, New Jersey, and I think yours starts in Morris Plains, New Jersey as well, Sheila, and you're not, this is what I was trying to find, but you're not from New Orleans, right?
No, I wrote the book.
You wrote it, but you're not from here, and you're from San Francisco. So I was just wondering, my first question is how does New Orleans figure into your work? You're not from here, but you wrote it here. What's that transplant kind of identity like? So that's question option number one. And question option two is, Tamela, you talked about working at Olive Garden while writing your book, correct? It just reminded me of this Japanese author who I love, who wrote this book called The Factory while she was working in a factory at night. And the other question option is, what Tamela said, kind of, her book is a collection of stories almost from many different walks of life. And it kind of just made me think of writing is filling the jar and just kind of filling up with memories and kind of building that well to draw from. So I was just wondering what everyone's writing process is like, what inspires them, coffee or tea, whatever. And I'll just pass the mic and we will say goodbye.
So I'm from San Francisco. I've lived here for almost 10 years. I think that I'll never forget landing at the airport. I had been working as an au pair in London for the summer, and just coming into the airport to the Greyhound station in Baton Rouge, and just being this is really, really different from everywhere else I've been or lived. It was 2 in the morning. I think that the things that inspire me about the South are the corruption, which was present immediately upon arriving. Not that San Francisco doesn't have corruption too, it does. I think it's just a little bit more obvious when you're from somewhere that you're not from. I think that the kind of catastrophic weather, which has always been a part of here, and we know that it's getting worse, that really stressed me out, and I think that anxiety kind of found its way. Just kind of the little daily kind of sometimes environmental horrors that you experience in Louisiana, just walking to my MFA in Baton Rouge and seeing a dead snake in the road. That type of stuff became much more a part of my life, and I think that's probably why the environment kind of crept into a book. I thought it was just going to be a book about feminism, but it became very clear upon moving here that it was going to be a book about climate change as well.
I came to New Orleans because I knew that I could write a really good book here. And before that, I was basically living Hood Wellness, and then I came here when it was time to write it. And when I was living Hood Wellness, I was living in Miami at the time, and it was during the pandemic, and I was hyper isolated. I had no form of community. I didn't have anybody to check on me. And a lot of Hood Wellness is based off of the framework that first step is identifying your needs, second step is identifying your challenge, the third step is identifying your people and how you can kind of move further personally and collectively. And I couldn't do that in Miami, and I came here and I realized when on a vacation just how fun it was and how cool everybody was, and I knew that I could get that kind of community and framework and stuff. So that was essentially what had opened the door. And when the introduction of Hood Wellness discusses the fact that before I had come here, the book was going to be a very clean cut, this is how you take care of yourself kind of thing. And I went to a book signing at the community center, and it was Jarvis DeBerry who was discussing his book, and he said something that changed the whole course of Hood Wellness, which was that he wished he would have been braver. He wished that he would have said more things, and I was shocked by that because I read his book and I found it to be incredibly brave as well as artistic. And then I kind of looked at my book and then I thought like, well, you know, what am I not being brave about? And that really, during that time here, was able to like kind of push the envelope and talk about the things that I likely would have left out.
Jarvis Berry is Jen. Listen to him speak and read forever. I'll speak to the process, and I spend a lot of time thinking about my writing when I'm not writing, which seems fairly obvious, but the characters exist in my head constantly. And one habit that I have broken is that I do not sit and stare at a page unless I have a vision for what is going to happen. And I put a lot of pressure on myself when I was working and writing to just say, well, those are my working hours and now I'm gonna sit and write, and I had nothing to say. And so I really make use of that non-writing time, which is when the story happens. You know, when you're living it, when you're studying people, when you're eavesdropping, when you're imagining, that's when the story develops.
I guess I've talked a lot about craft, so I'll speak to the influence of the city on the work. You know, the book is dedicated to the city, which is our people, and my family. Having been here since the 1700s and having everything that I do is through the lens of my cultural roots here and my experiences here as a young person, as a mother, as a teacher. And even forwarding, you know, performances, I always open my performances with a dedication, with an offering, and the book itself functions in that way as an offering. And it seemed the most appropriate way to enter into this part of my official writing career. And so the book itself starts in New Orleans. It's very much about, you know, my childhood in St. Roch and in the Ninth Ward. And even when I leave, there's this, the language, the sensibility is all informed by the primacy of water here. Everything is water and fire in this book. And so, in much the same way, you know, there's this idea of paraclama, sort of mapping the world from a central point through experience and then return to that place. And no matter how far I go from New Orleans, the distance is sort of always on the map for me. And there's always this idea of return, no matter how far I go. And so the book is very much for the city and sort of a look of gratitude for that. Yeah.
I'll speak about New Orleans as well. So I was born in the DR. I lived in the DR until I was 14. And then from 14 to age 30, I lived in Newark, which I consider to be the place where I'm from, just for having spent those formative years. But New Orleans, I mean, nobody chooses to be an immigrant. You were forced into that. I was brought into that. But New Orleans is the first place that I chose. And so that will always be a special thing for me because I chose to come here. It's also the first place where I have genuinely felt the most loved in all of my life. I don't know if it's because of the circumstances or whatever, but I came here, and this sort of speaks back to our self-awareness of calling ourselves artists. I came here with a lot of doubts and also a lot of desire to take risks. And I was embraced by people literally a few months upon arriving. No one questioned whether I was a writer. Everyone made me feel like I was a writer. So there will be no book about Newark, no book at all, no writing identity without just the number of people that I've come across in my time in this city, which I've made my home. So I feel so much love because I chose it, and I've chosen to stay, and so much gratitude because of the way that I've been loved and cared for, unlike anywhere else. Yeah.
I'll also speak to New Orleans. So I'm Korean American, born in Iowa, raised in New York for 10 years, then in a tiny little American expat bubble in Seoul for the next 10 years. And then when I came here, something I really liked, because I work at night, I'm a night owl, is you can just go out, the bars are open late, and just have a nice time there. So the easy drinking, easy living atmosphere really appealed to me. It's a very romantic place. I very much enjoyed it.
Yay. Well, what a good note to end on. I love New Orleans. It has such a good sense of community, especially for artists. They really accept you and support. It's amazing here. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us, and thank Megan Holt and the Words and Music Festival and the audience. Thank you for coming out. Buy all our books.
Yes, buy all our books. They are available in the vestibule from our festival bookseller, Tubby & Coos Traveling Bookshop. I'm going to speak for all y'all on stage right now, and I say you'll be happy to hang out inside. Yeah? Look at those enthusiastic nods. Buy their books, y'all. But we have to remember, we've been on Bayou Road for 2 years. Candace has been our bookseller since 2018. She's been here with us through the pandemic years. Sorry, they've been with us through the pandemic years. And have really been just part of the driving force of making words and music. But when we moved on Bayou Road, we had to recognize that there was already a bookstore in existence here, and it is the oldest Black-owned bookstore in the city. And how do you come on Bayou Road and not respect that? So we are going to support 2 local independent booksellers. You're going to buy all their books here at the festival bookseller right outside the vestibule, and then you're going to go next door and buy more books. And to do that, we're going to help you out. At every session, if you RSVP'd on Eventbrite, you were automatically entered to win a $25 Community Book Center gift card. And the winner of this is Christina Ward. Christina? All right, let me hit my randomizer again, because I don't hear anyone getting excited. Cree Petaway? See? So people win things, they make a noise. I can't see you, Cree, but I'll find you outside and hand you a gift card. Stick around, 5:15. We are having the debut of an original play by local playwright Fernando Rivera. He was on the stage last year in an event curated by Michelle over here. And he will be debuting a play based on a poem by former Louisiana Poet Laureate Mona Lisa Saloy. The poem is called 7th Word Tummy. So come on out, stick around till 5:15, get some books signed, and come back in for a play.